Right, I want to welcome you all here this evening. This is a great crowd. We're over 102 people, and as far as the Fontainebleau Historical Society is concerned, this is a big wow, and it's a great opportunity for us to see you and you to see us. And we're going to go right back to the 22nd and 23rd of January 1879, and that is at Rocke's Drift. You heard you heard Andrew talking at Burnt Orange about Arsenalwana, and now he's going to be talking about Rocke's Drift, which was 1 week later. Not a week later? Well, you can correct me, we'll get there. Okay, well, it was a garrison that they were defending, and a hospital, and the British troops who lost everything in Arsenalwana fought back in this particular case, and they defended themselves with biscuit tins and mealie meal bags to prevent the assegais coming into their bodies, and you'll hear what happened to the Zulus. But Andrew will tell the story from both sides, and it's a very bloody ending for all. So I hope you'll enjoy what Andrew tells you, and you'll enjoy the meal tonight, I'm quite sure. So thank you all for being here.
Right. So just as an idea, are there any that weren't here when we spoke about Isandlwana? Right, so now instead of being an hour, we're going to be 2.5 hours. No, I'm kidding. We won't rehash too much of what happened at Isandlwana, because that did take just over an hour to tell that story, but they happened on the same day. So a tiny little bit of context just to get things going. And those that were at the last one will have to excuse the first 5 minutes or so of this, but the British Plan of Confederation of South Africa, for various complicated reasons, it came about, and the British decided to issue the Zulus with an ultimatum. The ultimatum was eventually issued to the Zulus on the 11th of December 1878. The thrust of it was that they'd have to disband their army within 30 days, and if they failed to comply with this, the British would come and disband it for them. The invasion obviously had begun prior to that, or the planning for the invasion had begun prior to that, and the big central column number 3, which Chelmsford decided to accompany, and so he superseded the column commander, Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn, was to move from Pietermaritzburg to Greytown, cross the Tugela River at the Tugela Ferry, and up onto the big plateau, the Biggersberg. They fortified a position there called Helpmekaar, and when everything was proceeding according to plan, or Chelmsford deemed that it was proceeding according to plan, he descended down the Nostripper Pass to Rocke's Drift. It was New Year's Day, 1879. And there he waited for the ultimatum to expire, but Rocke's Drift had quite a history up until this point. If one looks at the mountain, the Zulus call it Shiane, Ishia, as an eyebrow. The mountain looks like an eyebrow. If you can't see the laser, I'm sorry, you'll just have to use your imaginations here. But it is, in fact, we can only see from Rocke's Drift itself, or from the settlement, you can only see the rump of the hill, but it is, in fact, a rather large mountain. It rises up beyond the rump of the hill here and drops off down into the Buffalo River. It's bordered by these terraces of sandstone here that are puckered with caves which are filled with Stone Age artifact and rock art. Archaeologists intimate that this site has been continuously occupied for tens of thousands of years, and this human occupation may have something to do with the geological feature on the Buffalo River 1,000 yards away. The Buffalo River up until this point is a big, slow, meandering stream, and at this point it starts to cut its way down into the low country, and its first move in doing so is it slides over a series of sandstone shells which form the most magnificent series of natural causeways. Now, a drift, as most of you will know, is a natural fording point on a river. There's a particularly good drift here at Rocke's Drift, and it was this ford that attracted those Stone Age people, and it was this ford that attracted Lord Chelmsford and his men. Now, Rocke's Drift was named after an Irish trader come farmer called James Rocke, Esquire, and he established himself there. He had a huge piece of land off to the west from the Shiane mountain, and he built himself a house on the top of a shelf of sandstone This used to drop off about 4 foot sheer. The missionaries have since broken and filled in this steep bank here. So you need to imagine this as a 4 foot sheer drop down below. He built a house which he and his wife lived in, and he built himself a storeroom 40 yards to the north of it, which is where the little church stands today. And all you need to do to this building is give it a thatched roof and give it a veranda along its long side here, and you've got the storeroom pretty much the same size and shape as what James Rocke had built. For the rest of the scene here, please remove every single building that you can see. I'll be using this slide quite a lot. The only 2 buildings that we have is that one and that one. All right. Everyone clear on that? Please remove all the other ones, and obviously remove the corrugated iron roofs and give them a thatched roof. Rocke used to keep his milk cows in the well-built stone cattle kraal, which is actually still in its original position there at the northern end of this ledge. The ledge runs along all the way around the corner there. You can imagine this ledge that you see up above, but the same feature down here that has since been filled in the intervening years. Now, Rocke used to trade with his friends the Zulus. He was great friends with the chieftains Chayo, Kakong, Ngobese, Wamakungebe. Anyone care to try and repeat that one, same as we did last time? That's the second time some of you have heard it. Anyone want to give it a go? Yeah? No? Right? A couple more times. Interesting point here before we get too deep into the story. King Cetshwayo, the king of the Zulus, said something rather prophetic in around 1875, 1876. He said, first comes the trader, then comes the missionary, then comes the red-coated soldier. And you'll see how true those words were to be. So James Rocke traded with his friends, the Zulus. Also, one's got to bear in mind here, has anyone been to Rocke's Drift before, by the way? Oh, good. What are you doing here? Anyway, so Rocke's Drift today is an incredibly remote part of South Africa. Back then in 1879, it was less remote than it is today, believe it or not. It was on the major trading route up into Mozambique in particular. And the local hunters of the period all tell us that James Rocke was married to the most beautiful woman. Sarah was her name. And they said that after a long and protracted hunting trip to Mozambique and back, it was absolutely obligatory to pop in at Rocke's Drift just to gaze into the eyes of Sarah. They said she had the effect of raising a man's flagging spirit. And there is a photograph of Sarah in the museum at Rocke's Drift today. Now, I've stared at this photograph long and hard. And beauty I cannot find. And anyone, I think, who's been through there cannot come, or can't help but come up with the inescapable thought that Sarah's beauty must have had something to do with the scarcity value she must have enjoyed in these parts at this time. Now, James Rocke spent a fair amount of time, he'd lived there since 1849, sitting on his veranda there, looking out at his view, which was not a bad one, and apparently he sat there taking in vast quantities of square-faced gin, to which eventually he becomes addicted. In 1875, James Rocke sent his women servants off to Ladysmith to replenish the supply of square-face, and they failed to return with this precious commodity, and in a fit of alcoholic rage, James Rocke shot himself. He now lies buried about 300 yards from the mission building at the foot of the Oscarberg Mountain. He's buried under a yard of concrete. He didn't want anyone to interfere with his remains. And exit James Rocke from our story. Now, this property then passes into the hands of the Swedish Missionary Society. First comes the trader, then comes the missionary. And slightly better looking than Sarah was the Reverend Otto Witt. And Witt took over this little position known as Rocke's Drift, and he lived there with his wife and 3 infant children. He didn't have the gorgeous daughter that the movie Zulu gave him, for those of you that have seen the film. Now, it's not clear if Witt demolished Rocke's old house, or if he simply added on to it, but he built himself a substantial dwelling, and it sits on the same spot as where the little museum is today, on the same spot that James Rocke built his house. This was the building that was destroyed by fire during the course of the Battle of Rocke's Drift, but Witt returned in 1879 and rebuilt his house pretty much on the same foundations and according to the same design. And as I said to you earlier, for all intents and purposes, just give this building a thatched roof and again a veranda on the front here, and you've got the building as Otto Witt had it. Now, there's a peculiar little bit of South African colonial architecture to this building. In the front, let me go back a slide, it consisted of two big ante-rooms, and then around the back of the building are these series of little cubbyhole type rooms. There are walls in between these rooms. We'll go through the slide quite a bit later on. And these rooms all largely communicate with the exterior. There are very few interleading doors inside this building. And the reason for this was that the loo, the good old dunny or long drop, was outside. And it was easier to get to, particularly at night, if you just walk straight out your bedroom across the lawn to the loo. And this plays a pivotal role in the story a little later on. Now, Chelmsford, having arrived down at Isandlwana on New Year's Day 1879 from the heights of Helpmekaar is at about 5,500 feet above sea level, and he was now down at Rocke, which is just over 3,000 feet. He noticed his men started to succumb almost immediately to those maladies that took more lives of British soldiers in this country than ever did the spears of the Zulus or the bullets of the Boers. Dysentery and enteric, typhoid, cholera. There's something that's still rather relevant today, things like cholera. But it's an interesting thing. As soon as you move down in lower altitudes, much warmer, much wetter, and these men all started to get sick. And Chelmsford needs a hospital. What better hospital than Witt's House? Now, the relationship between the British and the Swedish was not all that cordial, and it was with little pain in his imperial breast that Lord Chelmsford commandeered this building. He took it from the Swede, and he converted all these little cubbyhole rooms that I've just described to you into hospital wards, into which these sick men were placed. And he converted the two big ante-rooms on the front of the building, one into a surgery and one into a dispensary, and he placed this whole medical establishment under the command of a small, spider-like little surgeon called James Henry Reynolds. He was to become a famous man, was Reynolds. And while Chelmsford was on his commandeering spree, he thought he might as well take the storeroom. Witt had converted the storeroom into the precursor of the church today. This building is in fact an historic building. It was completed in 1882 and was built using some of the stone from Rocke's original storeroom. But Chelmsford booted the whole shooting match out of there. Witt had started running church services in that part of the world, and during the week he would run classes during which he taught the local Zulu people the rudiments of education. But that didn't really bother Chelmsford. He booted them all out of there, and he converted it into a commissariat store. Now I want you to imagine that inside this building, packed up to the rafters in there, are hundreds and hundreds of big, heavy wooden boxes. These boxes contained army biscuits. They're 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet, and they have a metal liner with a screw top, and they weigh 100 pounds each. And they're boxes and boxes of .450/577 Martini Henry ball ammunition. Obviously one needs that for a military invasion. And boxes of tinned meats. And outside the stores is this huge pyramid of 200-pound bags of Indian corn or maize meal. Staple diet of the British soldier. One thing that the British had in common with the Zulus was their diet. Stiff white maize meal. And he places this whole commissariat department under the command of a commissary officer by the name of Walter Alphonse Dunn. And Dunn had a particularly competent assistant. He was acting assistant commissary James Langley Dalton. He was also to become a famous man, was Dalton. Now Chelmsford paces up and down waiting for the ultimatum to expire. The ultimatum duly expires at midnight on the 10th of January, and on the 11th of January the invasion of Zululand begins. And we've already discussed Chelmsford's fate, but for those that weren't there for that one, Chelmsford crosses the Buffalo. He has that successful skirmish against Rocke's old friend Schaio. Charlie Harford put the beetle into the matchbox. Schaio's warriors were flushed from their caves. He destroyed Schaio's homestead. He then moved from there up onto the shoulder of the Isandlwana hill, and filled with complacency, Chelmsford set up camp. He split his force, headed off to the southeast, and whilst he was away, Raw and his patrol strayed up onto the Mutu heights. They found the main Zulu army. The Zulu army attacked the camp at Isandlwana, destroyed it within 2 hours, and harried the fugitives down the fugitives' trail, where Melville and Coghill died in that vain but gallant attempt to save the Queen's colour of their regiment. Is that a reasonable précis on what happened at Isandlwana? There was an eclipse of the sun as well. I mean, we could have done that in 3 minutes the other day, and we could have just carried on. And we could do the same this evening, but I suppose it wouldn't be quite as much fun. So everyone happy with where we are at this point? Okay, and it is now then 3:30 p.m. on the same day, Wednesday the 22nd of January 1879. This region is still bathed in that eerie quarter light of that eclipse of the sun. The eclipse was due to end at 10 minutes to 4. So let us imagine what we have here from an aerial perspective, because we've managed to remove most of the buildings in this photograph. Please remove that one from the scene over here. So what we've got is a hospital and a storeroom and the big pile of meaty bags over there. Everyone happy with that? Between the two over here there stands a cookhouse and an oven. Hello. For the rest, the scene consisted of bare felt up into the mountain. So we've got in the hospital here, under the command of that small spider-like little Surgeon Reynolds, there are 35 sick men in the hospital. 28 are seriously sick. 16 are so sick as to be immobile. Then in command of the stores, we've got Dunn, Dalton, and a staff of 5. Chelsea left behind here at Rocke's Drift a garrison, which consisted of a single company of men. Company's roughly 100 men. This was B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. Now there was a distinct Welsh character to B Company. The barracks had moved to Brecon, and many of the men had been drawn from the valleys of Gwent and Cwmbran in County Monmouthshire. The men of B Company were all raw recruits. They'd been drawn from the valleys to help complete the 9th Frontier War in the Eastern Cape. No one in B Company has ever been in a major battle before. Their officer, however, was not a Welshman. He was an Englishman. His name was Bromhead, Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. They really don't name their kids like they used to. Now, Lord Wolseley, that most caustic of all men, had harsh words to say of Bromhead after this battle. He said he was a nice enough chap, but that he was hopelessly stupid. He conceded that he was brave enough, but in every other respect he was a below average officer. Now this is a typically Wolseyan, typically scathing, incorrect summation of character with which I cannot agree. But to add to Bromhead's difficulties was the fact that this poor soul was partially deaf, and his deafness, as some have said, may well have been one of the reasons why he was left behind in safety, so it had been thought. Chelmsford also left here at Rocke's Drift a gigantic priest. He was a giant of a man, was Padre George Smith of Rocke's Drift. He was 6'6" in height, he weighed 260 pounds. They said he was pure muscle from the top of his head to the balls of his feet. He had a huge red spade-shaped beard. And during the course of this battle, he earned himself the everlasting nickname of Ammunition Smith by stalking around this little piece of ground, handing out packets of ammunition to the men, shouting at the men, exhorting them, saying, "Don't swear, boys, don't swear. For Christ's sake, just shoot." Marvellous character from the Battle of Rocke's Drift is Padre George Smith. Chelmsford also left at Rocke's Drift 300 black soldiers of the Natal Native Contingent, or NNC. As I said to those that were at the previous one, they were poorly trained with only 1 rifle for every 10 men and only 5 cartridges per rifle. These men were not to stay for the battle. Neither were their 11 officers and NCOs who were all drawn from the riffraff of Natal colonial society. And probably most important of all, he left here an officer of the engineers. His name was Chard. John Rouse Marriott Chard. How that name was to clang forever through the annals of British military history. Immortalised, it has to be said, by Stanley Baker's fine performance in that grand old classic movie, Zulu. I see a few nods. You may remember him. "I came to build a bridge," he said. And as Royal Engineer, Chard's duties extended down to the maintenance of the pont down at the Buffalo River. And that's where Chard was at 3:30 on this day. Chard said in his account, he said, "I looked up from my labours and I saw 2 men coming from across the Buffalo River with the speed of the clappers." He said within minutes they'd reined in their horses at the other side of the river. He took the pont across the river. He goes to meet these 2 men. They were 2 colonial officers called Vane and Ardendorf, and they blurted out that they'd come from Isandlwana, and they added that they'd come by the road, which may be telling us that these men had left Isandlwana some time before they should have, perhaps, before the right horn had cut that road off to Rocke's Drift. Anyway, they offered some weak explanation for this early departure, and they blurted out the news to Chard that the camp at Isandlwana had fallen to the Zulus and everyone in it had been massacred. They also intimated to him that the same fate had befallen Lord Chelmsford and the rest of the column, which of course wasn't true. Anyway, Chelmsford brings him across the Buffalo River, and he arrived back on the Natal bank of the river, and there was a messenger waiting for him, and the message had come, and the messenger had been sent by Bromhead. Bromhead, in the interim, had been informed about what had happened at Isandlwana. Now, all the imperial officers, NCOs, and men that had fought at Isandlwana or managed to get out from Isandlwana didn't see fit to pop in at Rocke's Drift for a second innings. They'd had enough of that. But one of these 5 officers who escaped Isandlwana did have the good grace to pencil a note, and he'd given it to a dispatch rider, a native levy, and he'd asked this man to take it down to whoever he could find at Rocke's Drift. This messenger had arrived at Rocke's Drift. Bromhead read the note and gulped, and gave it to another messenger to send it down to Chelmsford, down to Chard, I beg your pardon, and I dare say Chard must have gulped as well when he read this note, because this note is the stuff of which this high drama is made. This note reads, Officer Commanding Rocke's Drift, the camp at Isandlwana has been sacked by the Zulus and all our men in it have been massacred. Nothing can stand in the way of this unstoppable Zulu army, and at this very instant a huge wing of this army is on its way to hit you at Rocke's Drift, and your only course of action, for God's sake, is immediate flight. Signed, Captain Alan Gardner, 14th Hussars. Chard puts the note in his pocket and he makes his way up to the post. I think he was expecting to find that provision was being made for the evacuation of this post, and he may have been surprised to find that a decision had been taken in his absence, and what a decision that was. And the decision was largely Dalton's, that acting assistant commissary officer. He was an older man. He was a retired sergeant who volunteered for this campaign, and he's a man who I think should be given far more credit for what happened here at Rocke's Drift than has hitherto been the case. You know, all the kudos goes to Chard and Bromhead, but it was Dalton who, on a little scrap of paper, had come up with the brilliant little plan for the defence of Rocke's Drift. Now, the cynics will tell you that the decision to stand and fight here was motivated by all the sick men in that hospital. Remember, there were 35 sick men in the hospital, 28 were seriously sick, 16 so sick as to be immobile, and to get these men out onto the 2 wagons that were still there and out across the plain, up the Northstroper Pass to help McCarr, there's a pretty good chance that they would be caught in the open and destroyed, and that of course is true. And the cynics will also tell you that the decision to stand and fight was motivated by all the rounds of ammunition in that commissariat store. There were over 25 or 22,000 rounds of ammunition in that commissariat store, and to let that quantity of ammunition fall into the hands of the enemy would constitute the ultimate disgrace, and that of course is also true. But whatever the cynics say, there's a great deal of that marvellous old maxim that built this empire in this story, that British soldiers stand and fight. History's full of it, to the point of madness, really. But there's no better example of this maxim being put to better effect than on this little piece of ground on this day. Dalton's plan was to get these men of B Company and the men of the Natal native contingent, and they run out across to that huge pile of mealie bags in front of that commissariat store, and they ferry these bags, and they run a wall 4 feet high from the southwest corner of the hospital to the edge of the ledge. They then turned it 90 degrees to the right, and they ran it right the way along the top of this ledge all the way to that stone cattle kraal. They then ran the 4-foot high wall of mealie bags from the cattle kraal to the commissariat store. They walled up the windows and the doorways of that commissariat store with biscuit boxes and with mealie bags, and they loopholed holes through the walls on the eastern and northern sides of that building. They then ran this 4-foot high wall of mealie bags from the southwest corner of the store to the northeast corner of the hospital. They incorporated the 2 wagons into this defensive arrangement over there. They stuffed mealie bags between the wheels. It was brilliant. What it did is it tied these 3 features together. And they've also given themselves this great northwestern rampart, which, if you were an attacker, would constitute at least an 8-foot high barricade, because you've got 4 feet of ledge with 4 feet of mealie bags on the top. Now, implicit in this whole grand scheme is that the walls of the eastern and southern sides of this hospital building are going to face on to that Zulu attack. And these, of course, are those little cubbyhole type rooms that have all these sick men on them, and it was deemed to be an unnecessary waste of time to evacuate the sick men out of the hospital. Where are you going to put them? So they had to call upon men or volunteers from the ranks of these Welshmen to get in to these little cubbyhole type rooms to defend them. And it was at this moment that those immortal souls of British military history stepped forward. The likes of Private Henry Hook. Hook was the cook. Private Robert Jones, Private William Jones, Private John Williams, Private Joseph Williams, Private Thomas Cole. The good Welsh names, all of them. They said, "We'll do it, sir." It's a fantastic story. Hook said that they took him around. His room was here on the corner. They ushered him inside. They ripped the door off the frame and they walled up his doorway with mealie bags. He said it grew dark in there. There was no window. Then a soldier came along and loopholed a hole through the wall with a pickaxe. Hook said that he was grateful for this hole because it let some light in. And that wasn't the purpose of this hole. It was so that he could stick his rifle through and shoot. And Hook said that this man spoke with him through this hole. And he said to him, he said that never in his life, or never on his deathbed, he said he'd never forgotten this man's kind words. He said, "God bless you, soldier, God bless you." And never say die, nor surrender. And Hook said we were pinned in there. He said we were pinned in there like rats in a hole. Famous quote from the Battle of Rocke comes from Hook, the cook. Now the final parts of this defensive arrangement were just being put together when there was a commotion caused in front of the post, and the commotion was caused by the arrival of 70 mounted black soldiers of the Edendale contingent, Durnford's men. Those of you that were here will remember that moving interchange between Jabez Molefe and Simeon Kambula with Anthony Durnford when he handed him his horse and sent them off the field. They were reporting for duty now at Rocke. They were the only men that reported for duty at Rocke that day. Chard went out to meet them. They of course were made aware, passed on the message about what had happened at Isandlwana and offered their services to Chard, but they insisted on retaining possession of their horses. One can understand that. A mounted infantryman without his horses, not much, is he? But Chard did not want horses inside this defensive arrangement. They would stampede and cause confusion. So I think it was understandable that Chard then prevailed upon these men to turn themselves around and head back over that ridge, back in the direction of Isandlwana, and he asked them to please get there and try and harry this Zulu attack and just to slow them down for a little bit, give them a bit more time to complete this defensive arrangement. Now they'd been gone for some time, and Chard was beginning to wonder what had happened to these 70 Edendale contingent men. So he decided to send a patrol up onto the top of this Oscarberg mountain, and this patrol were 3 men, one of whom was that little spider-like Surgeon Reynolds, the other was the huge priest, and then of course there was that inevitable trooper. Someone had to carry the telescope. And they were sent up onto the top of the Oscarberg mountain to go and blast the valley to the north to see if they could see anything of this coming Zulu attack. And it was now about 4:30 in the afternoon. These men had just put in the final bits of this defensive arrangement into position when there was another commotion caused in the frontier, and it was caused by the return of those 70 Edendale contingent horsemen. Chard goes out to meet them. He and the officer exchange salutes, and this officer turns to Chard and he says, "Lieutenant Chard, I regret to inform you that my men no longer wish to listen to me." He said, "So we've been out at Isandlwana. We've seen what happened there. The Zulus are just over this ridge, and the same fate awaits you all shortly, sir." He said, "But I've managed to get my men to agree into taking up a position on this windy mountain opposite Rocke's Drift, and from there we will attempt to harry this immense Zulu attack that is coming from the flank, and that is the best that I can do." Well, Chard had to accept this. What else could he do? He and the officer exchanged salutes and off they went. One can only imagine what the soldiers of the 24th must have felt watching these 70 strong or highly trained, competent mounted infantrymen leaving the field. And as they were leaving the field, one of these Basotho horsemen turned around in the saddle of his horse and he shouted back at the 300 men of the Natal native contingent. In Zulu he said, "You fellows won't believe what happened at Isandlwana. Everyone has been murdered. Everyone has been cartwright disemboweled. The Zulus are just over this ridge and they're going to do the same to you shortly." And with that, apparently as one man, the 300 strong force of Natal native contingent, together with their 11 officers and NCOs all drawn from the riffraff of Natal colonial society, they decamped. They deserted. They jumped over that wall of mealie bags and they fled it off, or they fled off into in the direction of the setting sun. And so incensed were the soldiers of the 24th at this second desertion, so hard on the hooves of the first, that they fired a volley into this retreating mass. We suspect that they aimed at the white men because they succeeded in flooring a lance corporal called Anderson. He assumes that horizontal posture and he becomes the first rather undignified casualty of the Battle of Rocke's Drift, shot in the back for desertion. I want to put it to you that that leaves Chard and Bromhead and the men of B Company here in the most invidious position. This defensive arrangement was designed for a total strength of 450 men. 311 have just deserted. The total strength left here now is 139, 35 of whom are sick. 28 seriously sick, 16 so sick as to be immobile. And you've got various non-combatants. There are only 100 fighting men left here now. That's all. If you were to, for those who've been out to San Luana, you'll know this, but if you were to take all the military maneuvers from that battle and plot them on a map, you'd be amazed at how much territory would be encompassed. It's enormous. If you take Charlie Raw finding the Zulus off to the north, the left horn, the right horn, Chelmsford's movements out to the southeast, the flight of the fugitives down to the fugitives' drift, it's well over 100 square miles. But this place, Rocke's Drift, is tiny. It's smaller than 5 tennis courts. That's why it worked. Now that this rather flat little handful of British soldiers, though, left behind here, remember only 100 fighting men, it leaves a very thin little line to try and guard a now rather large defensive perimeter. And these two below average officers, below average my foot, they made another above average decision. They took this handful of Welshmen from the valleys, they raced into this commissariat store and they fetched out those big heavy wooden boxes that contained army biscuits, and they ran a wall 4 feet high from the southwest corner of the store to the edge of the ledge. They effectively cut this courtyard into 2/3 and 1/3 with a line of biscuit boxes. What it did was it shrunk their defensive perimeter. It gave them the option of falling back into the area on this side of the biscuit boxes or into the area on the far side of the biscuit boxes. One British soldier wrote home to his mother. He said, "My dear mother, the most important part of our entire defensive arrangement at Rocke's Drift was made of biscuit boxes." He added also in this letter, he said, "My dear mother, army biscuits can stop anything." Again, the finishing touches were just being put to this. Remember, it was as hot as hell. It was over 40 degrees on this day. There's a thunderstorm developing off to the west. These men have put this defensive arrangement together in under an hour. And they think they're going to die. That is the ultimate motivation, however. One's got to bear that in mind. About just after 4:30, they looked up onto the shoulder of the hill here. It must have been quite an arresting sight. And the sight is of this small, spider-like little surgeon hopping along from rock to rock, and followed by this gigantic priest with his big red beard flapping in the wind. And behind them comes the trooper with the telescope shouting that famous cry. His name was Bob Hall, by the way. That famous cry of the Battle of Rocke's Drift. He said, "Here they come! Black as hell and thick as grass." Famous line from the Zulu War, from this trooper. They race down the slopes of the mountain here, hopping and skipping down all those rocks and boulders. The surgeon jumps into the post, as does the priest, and someone probably hoofed old Bob Hall, the trooper, into this post, and they waited for 10 tense minutes. And nothing happened. These men then, after this slight delay, looked up onto the shoulder of the hill here, and they saw an enormous white stallion carrying double amanzi gambane, he who cleaves the water, the king's half-brother. And there's a full life-size photograph of double amanzi gambane in the museum at Rocke's Drift. There's a wonderful energy that comes out of this man's face with his head ring and his necklace of lion claws, the dignity and the simplicity of his man. He who cleaves the water, what a lovely name, double amanzi. And behind him they can see the plumes and the headdresses of the warriors of the 2 senior regiments, the Inruyangwe and the Inzonlo, and behind them come the two junior regiments, the Rocke and the Utulwana. And they squatted down on the slopes of this Oscarberg or Shiane mountain, and they filled this late afternoon with their war songs. What happened next was plain, simple human nature, really. The warriors of the two senior regiments prevailed upon the warriors of the two junior regiments to attack first. And that noise starts. That noise that was first described out at Isandlwana by that young Lieutenant Horace Lockwood Smith Dorian in that letter to his dad, like a gigantic swarm of angry bees. Z, 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 coming from 4,000 throats. What a moment that must have been. If you were a fly on the wall, that is. And that colour sergeant, Frank Bourne was his name. What a wonderful human being he must have been. He subsequently described himself self-effacingly as being 5'4" in height and painfully thin. He took it upon himself to go up to each and every soldier here at Rocke, and quietly and calmly he spoke with them, and he reassured them, and he said to them, "You mark your target, my boy, you mark your target as he comes, and you wait, my boy, until you can see the whites of his eyes." Now when one steps into the Harvard side chapel of the cathedral in Brecon in Wales, anyone been before? Yeah, good couple of followers. On the wall opposite all the Zulu War memorabilia there's a brass plaque that reminds us passers-by, lest we forget, of the hundreds of officers and thousands of men from this great regiment who fell during the Great War. And one can almost hear these Welshmen in the trenches at Gallipoli and on the Somme, reassuring Welshmen with the same surnames, Welshmen from the same valleys of Gwent and Cumbraen, with a similar cry, "Remember Rocke, boys, remember Rocke." The whole ethos of Welsh soldiery to this very day takes its eminence on this piece of ground, with this colour sergeant going up to each and every man saying, "You mark your target, my boy, you mark your target as he comes, and you wait, my boy, until you can see the whites of their eyes," and the Zulus going, "Z, Z, Z." Do you know that B Company, in the now single battalion of the Royal Welsh, is called B Rocke Company to this day? They send out officers and men every single year without fail to this piece of ground on the anniversary of the battle. It's quite a remarkable history. Then these warriors of the two younger regiments leapt to their feet and they came screaming down the slope towards the position at Rocke. And then something happened that I think no one was expecting. They got caught in a converging fire from that commissariat store, from the hospital building, and from the barricaded wall of mealie bags behind the wagons there, and that Zulu attack was checked. In its tracks, that Zulu attack was checked. And the lesson that was learnt at Rocke was a salutary one, and it was well applied hereafter. And the lesson was that you put the British soldier with his ammunition next to him, for God's sake, behind a barricade, in close contact with his comrades and his ammunition, as I said, and don't you dare betray him with poor tactics and poor leadership. Hell, he's a damn hard fellow to dislodge there, if all one has is a kiri and a spear and a shield and one's raw Zulu courage. Think of these Zulus. They're brave men. They take huge casualties in this area here, and the Zulu attack now swings around to the southwestern corner of the defensive arrangement, where there was a step, an irregularity in the sandstone. Here, the sandstone drops down for 2 feet, goes out for 10, and then drops another 2 instead of the 4-foot sheer. The Zulus knew about this. Brilliant thing in the Zulu army is that all the regiments were age groups. So it meant that in every single regiment there was someone from every conceivable corner of Zululand. It meant that they knew a great deal about the geography of their country. It's how they knew where to cross this Buffalo River, which was in a state of high flood on this day. And this Zulu attack now manages to get over this wall of mealie bags and onto the veranda of this hospital building and into those 2 big ante-rooms, the surgery and the dispensary. And these British soldiers furiously tried to build another wall of mealie bags from the northwest corner of the hospital to the edge of the ledge, but the Zulus just forced them over that, and they pushed these British soldiers, bayonets fixed, right the way back across this courtyard until they reached that wall of biscuit boxes. They jump over the biscuit boxes, they turn around, they fire back into these Zulus, and they manage to clear this courtyard of Zulus, and it becomes a no man's land. But that hospital building, with its inmates, was now left in the hands of the Zulus, and Rocke is really famous for what happened inside this building. If we were all on the field, we'd be standing here on the south side of that building. On the ground here are the bodies of 14 dead Zulus. Sticking out of the wall here is out of the mealie bags in the doorway is a Martini Henry rifle. On the other end of this rifle is a demon of a little Welshman. His name is Private Joseph Williams. His number was 1398. You had to use the numbers of the Williams here at Rocke. This was a Welsh regiment, remember? And if one shouted, "Williams!" half the garrison responded. Now Williams has killed all 14 of these Zulus, and a brave Zulu then creeps along the wall here, and as Williams thrusts his rifle out to try and bayonet another Zulu, this Zulu grabs Williams by the wrist and the rifle, and he pulls him, mealie bags and all, out onto the ground, where in full view of the horrified occupants of this room, two of whom were to share the same fate within seconds, they held him down on his back, they unbuttoned his tunic, and they opened him up. Now, in the corner here, well, let me go back a step. In fact, in this room with Private Joseph Williams is a young man. He'd enlisted at the age of 17. His name was Private John Williams. At the time, he was the youngest man ever to be awarded a Victoria Cross. Williams is in the room. Remember, that room with the two Williamses in on the south side of this building has only one door and it leads out to the outside. So armed with a pickaxe and a bayonet in his bare hands, John Williams starts to dig through the wall, the unfired mud brick wall between this room and the next room, until he has no flesh left on his fingers. You know that his hands never ever recovered from this. He died in his 70s and his hands were still ruined from this battle. Hook remembered. Hook was in the corner here. He was in this room. He said he heard that awful shout coming from next door that they dragged Joseph Williams out and killed him. Hook said that it was impossible to do anything except fight. He said the noise was indescribable. He said you've got the whiz and the rip of the assegais and the bullets plumping into the mealie bags. The tremendous recoil from the Martini Henry rifle in these confined spaces was deafening. The cries and groans of all these sick men lying around on the floor. And John Williams manages to get through into Hook's room. He immediately starts digging through this wall into the next room. He makes his hole, and they manage to get through into the next room. And that's how this battle progresses with these men, this famous sequential retreat, room by room, through right the way back to the courtyard. The sun then went dark that night. The moon went with it. There'd been an eclipse, remember. There would be no moonlight on this night. And as you all know, living in this country, we have very, very little twilight, particularly up in Natal. When the sun goes down, it gets dark pretty quickly. Then what was initially thought to be a terrible event occurred. A Zulu tied a faggot of dry grass onto the shaft of an assegai. He tossed it into this thatched roof, and this building is now on fire. And these poor souls in here now have Hobson's choice. If they stay, they burn. If they walk out onto that big broad-bladed assegai. So, as I said, these men did the impossible, and they start to fight this famous sequential retreat room by room through this building. It's almost impossible to do any justice to this story. Hook says that they get into the next room here. There were now 9 of them in this room. And John Williams again begins to make his next hole. They get into this next room. It's bigger. This was the Wit's bedroom. In this room, there was a man called Private Thomas Cole. Cole was a claustrophobe. Can you imagine the bravery of a man with a fear of confined spaces volunteering to get into this building to defend his comrades? He couldn't take it anymore. He put his rifle against the doorway and he walked out. He was instantly slaughtered by the Zulus. Hook said that in this room there was another man in here whose courage failed him. His name was Waters, Private John Waters. Waters climbed into, he didn't want to fight anymore, and he climbed into a cupboard that was in this room. It was Mrs. Witt's clothes cupboard. And while he was in this room, he bumped into a coat, a black coat. It was Mrs. Witt's black fur coat. He puts this coat on. He said he held that cupboard door tightly shut. Every so often, he said, once the defenders had left this room, he said he'd open the door slightly and peer out into the room. He said it was dimly lit. He could see the flitting shapes of Zulus running past. He said he held that cupboard door tightly shut and he prayed to Almighty God that he'd be saved. He goes on to say, he says, sometime later, it now being uncomfortably warm in the cupboard, he said he opened the door and the room was free of Zulus. Of course it was. It was too bloody hot for them in there. And he came up to the window here and he looked out and he said he could see the Zulu position was being beautifully lit. Of course it was. It was beautifully lit by the light from the fire reflecting off the pall of smoke. And one can't help but come away from this battle but wondering if the Zulus hadn't committed the ultimate faux pas in setting fire to that thatch. In fact, Hooke agrees. He says in his account that it gave them this brilliant light by which they could see and shoot the Zulus. Waters now, during a lull in the Zulu attack, climbs out of the window and he crawls out across into the dead Zulus and he lies down in amongst them, still dressed in Mrs. Witt's coat. There's a little model in the museum. It's in that room over there. Some of you would have seen it before. And if you orientate yourself correctly and you look down, there are 1,400 figures. There are over 2,000 figures, I should say, on this model. And you look carefully, you can see this blessed Welshman dressed in Mrs. Witt's fur coat. They found him in the morning. He was alive. Much bruised and battered was he, having been run over by the Zulus all night. But he was alive. What a story he had to tell. And I suppose it's safe to say that the name of Private John Waters is not one of those that you'll find mentioned in dispatches for bravery here at Vorster. We'd now be standing in the corner over there. There's not a window, but a doorway, just like these ones. In this room now, and you can imagine that every time they get into a new room, there are now more and more men in there. It becomes more and more difficult to move. In this room, there was a sick sergeant called Maxfield. Maxfield was delirious with fever. He was uncooperative. He didn't want to leave with the men. And these men battled for some time to clothe him. Only the British would do something like that. Well, we need to save your life, old boy, but best you put some clothes on first. And anyway, they managed to get the rest of the sick men through the final hole that John Williams had dug. This wall continues through the building, by the way. And they went back for Maxfield, but they found that the Zulus had burst into this room and had killed Maxfield in his bed. These men have now managed to fight their way through all of these rooms, and they're now at the last point. Now on this building, they are not, you'll see on the next slide, but I'll show you briefly and I'll go back to it. They're not 3 windows like they are today. There's one hole 8 feet off the ground, again showing that there was no architect involved in designing this structure. Hooke said that he climbed up the ladder and he looked out and he was horrified to find that the soldiers of the 24th were not here. They were behind the line of biscuit boxes. He had no mechanism of knowing that line of biscuit boxes was there. It had been put in while he was already holed up inside his little cubbyhole room. And these men now realize that they've now fought this wonderful sequential retreat around the periphery of what was in effect a little island. And in many ways, the worst was yet to come. There's Zulus sniping him. The Zulus throwing assegais at him from behind the mealie bags. He shouts across that he needs help from the other side of the courtyard. And 2 men volunteered for this task. They were the bravest of the whole lot of them. One man had already been wounded at this point. He'd been shot through the shoulder. His name was Hitch, Private Frederick Hitch. He was an Englishman, in fact. The other was a corporal called William Allen. Allen was from Monmouth, Hooke's hometown. Perhaps that's why he volunteered. He saw his fellow man from Monmouth in distress. And these 2 men put down their rifles and, trusting in the cover fire of their comrades, they race across this courtyard. And Hitch, shot through the shoulder, leans against this wall here and allows all of these sick men out over his back onto the back of Allen, and these men ferry these sick men back and forth across this courtyard, and only one man loses his life during this phase of the battle. He was an unfortunate Australian trooper of the Natal Mounted Police called Sydney Hunter, He was delirious with fever, and he staggered out across too close to the meaty bags here, when a brave Zulu jumped over and assegaied him before a bullet from behind the line of biscuit boxes found and killed the Zulu. Henry Hook died in March 1905. He died of consumption, tuberculosis, a poor man's disease. He was a very, very poor man. When he died, the men saw to it that he was buried in the little village of Churcham, near Gloucester, where he'd been born. If ever you find yourselves in the Cotswolds, take the time and go to Churcham. It's not hard to find. It's on the A40 just west of Gloucester. If you turn left into Church Lane, you'll find the church at the end of the road. And go and find the grave of Henry Hook. The simple headstone reads, "In loving memory of Alfred Henry Hook, VC, hero of the Battle of Rocke." It goes on to say that if one's time is come, one must die manfully, for one's brethren's sake, without cause for reproach against one's glory. They're good words for a good man. He was not the drunken malingerer that the film Zulu portrayed him to be. He was, in fact, a teetotaler. We're now standing behind the line of biscuit boxes. It's 47 paces across this courtyard. That's a long way with a man on your back. Frederick Hitch has now collapsed, and he's dragged up onto the veranda of that commissariat store where that small, spider-like little surgeon attends to him. In fact, an interesting part of the story here, that when he was dragged up onto there, Reynolds took one look at him and he said, "Put Hitch aside. He's done. He's as good as dead." And these men, risking a court-martial, said to him, "Sir, you will do something for Hitch." And in the midst of this battle, this surgeon, James Henry Reynolds, proceeds to remove 36 pieces of smashed bone from Hitch's shoulder. He binds Hitch up, and he sews Hitch up, he binds Hitch up, and Hitch promptly stood up. And he continued to serve the men with ammunition until he collapsed from pain and shock and loss of blood. They don't make them like they used to have, Connor. Frederick Hitch died on the 6th of January 1913. He was a cab driver. He drove some of the first black cabs through the streets of London. He lived near Chiswick. And when Hitch died, famous story this one, 1,500 black cabs took to the streets of London for a commemorative drive to celebrate the life of Frederick Hitch, VC. They're the most beautiful photographs of it. Old sepia photographs of this thin black snake making its way through the streets of that most awesome city. But the ones that moved me the most are the ones of the graveside. Those men that lowered Hitch's coffin into his grave, they're always the same. They're short, bronzed, bearded little Welshmen that had fought with him at Rocke. They stuck together until there were none of them left. Now, as I said, we're now standing at the wall or the line of biscuit boxes. If you fuzz your focus a little bit, you can see that famous Alphonse de Neuville painting, all that by Lady Elizabeth Butler. You can see the hospital on fire and the pall of smoke over there. You can see the hole above the wall. If you fuzz your focus a little bit, you probably make out Frederick Hitch, Henry Hook. The water cart is over there. Chard, in fact, forgot the water cart. He had to lead a bayonet charge across the courtyard to retrieve it. The fighting was thirsty work. It's thirsty enough trying to tell you the story. Imagine what it must have been like while doing that. Now the position here at Rocke is tiny. The whole thing is smaller than 5 tennis courts. This part's about the size of 2 tennis courts. That's the key. That's why it worked. These men could stand shoulder to shoulder around here. Imagine what it must have been like for these soldiers as the fire burned the building to the ground, and that stench of roasted human flesh starts to waft across the courtyard to these men. But worse than that is they are now fighting an enemy they can't see. Now, the lack of Zulu tactics in this battle is appalling. If the Zulus had come out using their famous tactic of the horns of the buffalo, like they'd done so successfully in the morning at Isandlwana, the Battle of Rocke would have been a very, very short battle indeed. But now that it's dark, the Zulus do come out in the horns of the buffalo. They surround this post, and they manage to take that stone cattle kraal, which is now part of the Zulu position. And as I said, it's now even smaller than it was before, but that's why it worked. It's at this point in the battle that you may have read accounts that the barrels of these Martini Henry rifles glowed red hot in the night. Some of the few Zulu accounts incidentally support this. You may have read of these men suffering from dislocated shoulders from the incessant recoil of the rifle. You may have read of these men burning their fingers and then having to tear their tunics to make makeshift gloves to hold these rifles, which were now too hot to hold. You may have read of these men suffering from broken cheekbones, blackened faces, and blindness, because the superheated breech could apparently cook off this primitive coiled brass cartridge before you even pulled the trigger. And if you didn't close the lever quickly enough on top of a fresh cartridge, it would blow it straight back out the breech, hitting you in the face. The cynics will tell you that these are exaggerations. And who knows where, in fact, the truth lies. But the quartermaster's report stands firm and says that 20,000 rounds of ammunition were fired off by this little handful of men. That statistic must tell its own story. You may have read the account of the little terrier, Pip. You can't tell a story about British military history without a dog involved, can you? And ironically, it was the question I used to get asked the most when I told this story, is because we deal with what happened to the soldiers, but what happened to the dog after the battle? They were more concerned with that than the men. But this little pooch had belonged to Lieutenant Charlie Pope, who may have had a premonition that something was going to happen to him, and he left the dog behind in safety. So he thought, well, something had happened to Charlie Pope. He was dead. He died out on the line at Isandlwana, and while Pope's body was stiffening out on the field of Isandlwana, his plucky little pooch was playing this heroic role. This little thing was running up and down the line of biscuit boxes and mealie bags, yipping and yapping and snarling and snapping, and giving away the positions of the Zulus, who were using their shields like surfboards to try and get close to this post. The dog would bark, and bang would go the Martini Henry rifle, and that's how this night passes, attack after attack after attack. In the corner, where the biscuit boxes meet the mealie bags, there was a Swiss man. Christian Ferdinand Frederick Schiess was his name. What a Swiss man was doing out here in South Africa fighting for the British against the Zulus is a fundamentally good question, for which I have no good answer. But what we know is he was a volunteer in the Natal Mounted Police, and he'd been injured in the skirmish with Rocke's old friend Schail. The instep of his right foot had apparently come adrift. It's hard to imagine a more horrendous injury. So he was actually one of the sick men in the hospital, but he'd insisted on being given a rifle and being given a post, and that's where Schiess was, over there. Schiess had been wounded again in this battle. A musket ball from the terraces up above, fired from one of the Zulus, had struck Schiess on the instep of this same foot, blasting out what little flesh he had left. Now another Zulu had crept into a notch of sandstone here, still there to this day in fact, and with his old tower musket he was taking careful and deliberate aim. He was letting fly down the line of mealie bags and biscuit boxes. He was causing much consternation and some casualties. And the British said, we need to do something about this. Who's going to do it? And Schiess, brave Schiess, said, well, it might as well be me. So Schiess crouches down in the corner there. He's waiting for the report of the Zulu's firearm, meaning he'd be incapacitated, getting his old muzzle loader ready for the next shot. He hears the report of a rifle, and he assumes that it's from the Zulu, and without an instep in his foot, Schiess climbs up onto the top of the biscuit boxes, raises his rifle to shoot the Zulu, and the Zulu raises his rifle and shoots Schiess. The bullet hits Schiess square on his headrest, knocking his hat off and stunning him. Schiess calmly shot the Zulu, bayoneted one and another, and nonchalantly retrieving his hat, takes up his position behind the line of biscuit boxes. Schiess to this day is the only Swiss man ever to be awarded the Victoria Cross, and unfortunately also met a rather sad end after the Anglo-Zulu War, and all the colonial units were disbanded. He was discharged. He wandered through South Africa. He found himself on the streets of Cape Town in 1884 in winter of 1884, and well, we all live in the Cape in winter, and it's a rather miserable place, quite often. And he was eventually taken in by the Royal Navy. He'd been trying to find work all the way along. He told them he was a defender of Rocke's Drift, and no one believed him, but he would not pull out his Victoria Cross to prove it. Shees was, as I said, taken in by the Royal Navy. He was offered passage back to London. Maybe he could get back to his beloved Switzerland, but he died en route, and he was buried out at sea off the coast of St. Helena. And when they were going through his personal effects, they found his Victoria Cross. They had no idea that there was this man amongst them. Eventually, at about 6 in the morning, that Zulu attack wavered and stopped. And the Zulus massed up on the plateau above, or on the slopes of the hill above, and they filled this, in fact probably a little before 6 o'clock, but they filled this leaden pre-dawn with their war songs. Chard was so convinced that this battle was going to go the other way that he ordered the building of the final redoubt, just to be made of the leftover mealie bags, 12 foot high, with enough space to contain 12 men. It was as if these men were building their own sarcophagus. That's how convinced he was that it was going to end. But it was not to be. The Zulu attack, or the Zulu warriors I should say, then turned and headed south from above, headed off in a southerly direction. Chard must have been filled with a sense of pride and a sense of awe in his soldiers, that 139 men, 35 of whom were sick, managed to hold out all night against this immense Zulu attack, and foreboding, because he knew that if that Zulu attack came one more time, it was over. He had only 600 rounds of ammunition left. But it was not to be. Chard then ordered that colour sergeant, Frank Bourne, to read the roll. And that stalwart little colour sergeant, the spine of the British Army, that man who described himself self-effacingly as being 5'4" in height and painfully thin, that man who'd held these men together throughout this terrible battle, he took up his position on the veranda of that commissariat store, and as he read out the names of those 15 men who were dead, and the 2 who were now lying, dying on the veranda of that commissariat store next to him, being attended to by that small, spider-like little Surgeon Reynolds, his voice cracked as he read the roll. Now go and watch that movie Zulu again. You will not get through that piece at the end where Bourne reads the roll with a dry eye. Frank Bourne read the roll, the Zulus were gone. Frank Bourne died on the 8th of May, 1945. VE Day. He was 91. He was the last of these true men of Harlech to die. He was tape recorded by the BBC in 1935 for the programme called I Was There. They interviewed him about the Battle of Rocke's Drift. The tape survived until 1960, when apparently it was thrown out of an archive, deemed to be of little future interest. What a shame that we can no longer listen to the voice of a man who was here. John Chard, Royal Engineer, ordered the able-bodied men, such as they were, to begin piling up the bodies of the Zulu dead that were lying 8 deep around this post. They piled them up in a great heap 100 yards away where that Zulu mass grave sits today. Can you imagine the horror when these men looked up and in the full light of the coming day they saw that the slopes of the Sklindi mountain opposite had turned black with Zulus. The Zulus had come back. Or worse, these are fresh Zulus, fresh on looted bully beef from the field of Isandwana. It then became clear to Chard that these were the same Zulus that had merely returned, and these Zulus started to sing their beautiful mourning war songs. Then he said the Zulus fell silent as one man, and they began to move out across the plain in front of the post. Not a word passed from the lips of a Zulu, said Chard. Such was the discipline of these fine warriors. The only sound that emanated from this retreating mass was the swishing of their great war shields that they dragged behind them through the long grass, those shields that were now piled high with the bodies of their dead comrades that they were taking back to their families for decent burial in the grain pits of those neat little beehive villages in the valley of the kings. Chard said that he heard the rifles cocking behind him, and he turned around to the men and he said, "Oh no, you hold your fire, and you let them go." And they let them go. The Zulus made their way down to the Buffalo River. The river had ebbed off its flood in the night, and the Zulus linked their elbows, and they forded that river like a great Roman testudo, and they headed off into Zululand, never ever to return. What had inspired the Zulus to leave at that point, we believe, was the sight of Lord Chelmsford coming out of Zululand. Chelmsford, you'll remember, had returned to Isandlwana after the battle was over, and he'd spent that terrible night sleeping amongst the dead and disemboweled remains of his former command. He wanted to march to the relief of Rocke's drift, and he wanted to leave Isandlwana before dawn to spare his men the full horror of what they were sleeping in and amongst. These men woke up and found that they'd been using the bodies of their dead comrades as pillows. And we now have this most remarkable event of this defeated British column coming out of Zululand and this defeated Zulu column coming out of Natal. These two opposing forces started to approach each other in the mist. No one did anything about this. And these two passed each other so close, some of these accounts tell us that they could see the expressions on each other's faces. And not a shot was fired. Maybe they'd all just had enough. Chelmsford did say that he was shocked to see so many Zulus leaving the field. They must have taken Rocke's drift. The Zulus said they were equally shocked to see so many British soldiers coming out of Zululand. They thought that their comrades had killed them all. Who knows? Chard said that they crossed the Buffalo River, but he said he was filled with a sense of dread that he was going to be finding another Isandlwana, and he sends a little patrol up to the post. These men galloped up there with their hearts in their mouths. They were expecting to find death and disembowelment. And what did they see? Not death and disembowelment. Oh no. They saw a little man. He was standing on the roof of the commissariat store. By hand, he was flying the Union flag. They said they looked through their glasses. They could see these men lying about, and only once they were right in and amongst them could they see what they were trying to do. They were trying to cheer. They couldn't even speak. A croak of a cheer came from one of the men, and these men cheered. They said with every cell in their bodies, they cheered, and that cheer was echoed by 2,500 throats down at the Buffalo River. Chelmsford hears this cheer. And he made his way up to the post, and that night he wrote a letter to his friend the Duke of Cambridge, and in this letter I think there lies a mark of the calibre of this man. 51-year-old teetotaler he was, a man who ate what his troops ate, this English gentleman that got trapped by Murphy's Law out at Isandlwana, and he had to carry the heavy cross of Isandlwana into his grave into the last century. He said he was greatly stricken. He said he was greatly stricken to find that there were no survivors from Isandlwana there. All the while this poor soul had been hoping against hope and hell and everything else that there had been some sort of tactical withdrawal from at least some of the men, but there hadn't. Therefore the disaster at Isandlwana was complete. Then he must have been filled with a sense of awe. Awe indeed that 139 British soldiers, 35 of whom were sick, armed with a Martini Henry rifle and a bayonet, and as that little colour sergeant Frank Bourne would be very quick to remind us all, with a good measure of British guts behind it, had held out all night against this impossible Zulu attack in what must surely be one of the most famous battles that Britain has ever fought. There were 11 Victoria Crosses awarded for valour in this battle. Statistically, it's the highest number of Victoria Crosses awarded to a single regiment in a single action in history. And that statistic stands to this very day, and of course includes both world wars. I want to put it to you that Rocke's drift today constitutes the most magnificent little understatement. You'll be moved as you move through that museum with the dignity with which the story is told. You will see decent schools. You will find decent, polite people. You'll find a world-famous arts and crafts centre there that produces tapestries, rugs and pottery that find their way into art galleries and homes all over the world. You'll be moved to know that in all the years that have passed since that dreadful day, that there has never ever been a single scratch of graffiti on any stone there. A mark of the calibre of this fine community in which we live. And I hope that as you wander around, that you would come across one, or two, or perhaps upon all three of the fine memorials that remind you passers-by of those 600 fine Zulu warriors who lost their lives here in the defence of their old Zulu order. And maybe moments like these are moments for us all to contemplate for once and for all. But the words of Lawrence Binion must surely ring true for all these men, black or white. That they shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old, and age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. And at the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Thank you all very much for your time this evening. I have to be careful. Biscuit box.
Right, you've had an antelope, you've had a dolphin, you've had a pangolin, and now?
No, we have a dolphin, a pangolin, and now we have a warthog.
Yes, well done.
Thank you very much, Lynn.